Okay, so we're back in the wisdom literature of the Bible today, almost like it's a planned series. A month and a bit ago, we were in Proverbs, which I characterized as the optimistic one of the wisdom books. If you were to personify the book of Proverbs, it might be young, bright-eyed, full of potential, and that kind of personification carries through to the image of the world that Proverbs paints. The world, according to Proverbs, is fair and balanced. If you do the right thing and order your life in the right way, you will have a good life. And in an ideal world, this would be true. I think it's a version of reality that we all long for in a way, but unfortunately, we live in a fallen world. And sometimes it looks a lot different than the picture that Proverbs paints. So we talked about Ecclesiastes, which I characterize as the cynical one of the wisdom books. If you were to personify the book of Ecclesiastes, it might be like a surly type of person. Maybe you see them at a party and walk the other way and avoid them at a party. They don't look at the world through rose-colored lenses and quickly break the bubble of anyone who does. But this personification of Ecclesiastes is a faithful person who carries a resilient hope that breaks through injustice and despair, and they, along with Proverbs, are who you want by your side when you're in the thick of it. I've said this the last 2 times I spoke, it's worth repeating. One of my favorite things about the wisdom literature is how it illustrates God's understanding and care for our plight, right? Proverbs serves as an example of God giving us a very practical roadmap of sorts, while the other 2 wisdom books we're looking at in the series, Ecclesiastes and Job, give us a way to wrestle with the reality that life doesn't always follow the roadmap. No matter how good the map is, sometimes a piece gets torn, or there's construction that forces a detour, and it can not only be frustrating, but disheartening. And God is not blind to this reality and its effect on us. The existence of Ecclesiastes and Job demonstrate that God not only knows that life can be difficult, but that he wants to meet us in that difficulty and help us through it. And one way we can see that care and learn how to navigate our lives in this world is by reading the wisdom literature. And while Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job can be read as standalone books, when you read them together, they paint a pretty thorough picture of what wisdom is and how it can help direct our lives. So in case you missed the many hints, today we're in Job, a book about a man whose life puts both Proverbs and Ecclesiastes to the test and shows us how God's wisdom and purpose is present even when everything seems lost and we don't see how that wisdom and purpose could possibly be at work. Normally, I spend time giving some historical and contextual background on the Old Testament books when I speak, and New Testament books when I speak on them, in order to help us better apply them to our own context. Unfortunately, in the case of Job, it's like, is that better? It was? It's like, okay, sorry. I hear myself. It's fine. So unfortunately, in the case of Job, we don't really know the context of its writing. We don't know when it was written. We don't know by whom it was written. We know that it, or at least the knowledge of the person or character of Job, likely existed before the book of Ezekiel, because Job is mentioned in Ezekiel along with the likes of Noah and Daniel as an example of righteousness. And based on this mention, it appears that many believe that Job was a real live person, which he may well have been. But regardless of when Job may have lived, the type of vocabulary used in the book of Job suggests that it may have been written later, possibly during or after the Babylonian exile. And if that's the case, it suggests that the knowledge of the person of Job, his story and his character, was probably pretty widespread well before it was written down, which is not unusual. Modern Western culture puts a lot of emphasis on written narrative, written traditions, written history, and sometimes misses the value and historical prevalence of oral traditions. It's entirely possible that Job's story is quite old and wasn't written down until way after it might have happened, specifically in Uz at the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So while we don't have a ton of context to underpin the story of Job, we don't really need it. The reason I think the story of Job was so widespread before it was written down is because of the timeless nature of the themes and questions that Job asks and wrestles with. Who of us hasn't wondered why good people suffer and what that means about the character of God? So let's get into Job. It's long, so I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to read some long passages, but not right now. First, we're going to set the stage. So Job starts with a prologue where we're introduced to Job, a man who honors God and lives a life so marked by righteousness, that he is called blameless. Not an easy feat to be called in the Bible. If we didn't already know the story of Job, and maybe some of us don't, we might expect that a man like this, a blameless, righteous man who honors God, would be raised up to be a king or a prophet. Based on the promises of Proverbs and our innate sense of fairness and justice, we'd expect Job to be blessed because he's such a good guy. Instead, we're transported to heaven, where we see God holding court, almost like a monarch holding court. Job comes up in conversation, and God praises him as somebody who is truly righteous. But not everybody in court agrees. A figure called the Satan, spelled like Satan, meaning accuser or prosecutor, speaks up against Job. He challenges God's assertion that Job is righteous. The Satan reminds God that, generally righteous people are blessed, and that's why they're righteous. They want the reward. They do the right thing to get the good thing, not because of some core innate goodness or love for God. God, though, disagrees. He's like, no, Job is righteous because that's who he is. He loves me because he loves me. He serves because he serves. So the Satan challenges God to let Job suffer. He says, if you want to see what kind of man he really is, take away your blessings. Leave him with nothing, and then see how he reacts. So the stage is set. Job will be tested. God is sure he'll prevail, and the Satan is sure he won't. But Job doesn't know any of this. He's just living his life, enjoying it at the moment. And as we read through the bulk of the rest of the Job, we see that test play out. Job suffers. And I mean, he really suffers. He loses everything: his wife, his property, his children, his health, everything but his life. It's unfathomable. And during his suffering, Job's friends come to comfort him. Reasonable. I would hope that if any of you lost everything, I would come to comfort you. I would also hope that I would do a better job than these friends. When they come to they're meant to, as characters, to symbolize the prevailing wisdom tradition of the time, this idea, do the right thing, get good things. But as we see them interact with Job, it becomes clear that they represent an oversimplified misreading of wisdom tradition. They are rigid in their understanding of God and justice, and argue that all troubles, including Job's, are punishments for wrongdoing. They provide simple answers to Job's suffering that completely discount the reality that Job did nothing to deserve it. They don't sit with Job in his suffering to help him bear it. In their attempt to find a quick fix, they go to blame. They need it to make sense for them. Well, you must have done something wrong. Why else would this happen to you? If you didn't do something wrong and it's happening to you, maybe it could happen to me. So they assign blame. And in doing so, they fail to provide the comfort that they came to give. Something I think we've all maybe been guilty of at one point or another. And something that reminds me a little bit of Matthew 7, 1-5, which I'll read. Judge not that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is a log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Whatever the circumstance and whatever the intent, even if it's to provide comfort like Job's friends, we ought not to be providing judgment on somebody else's circumstances before we take a good long look at ourselves. And I think that Job's friends could have maybe taken a moment to do that. But with that aside out of the way, let's return to Job and his response to his friends. He defends himself. Of course he does. He asserts his innocence. He's like, I didn't do anything. You're wrong. And he's right. We know he's right. We saw earlier in the book the interaction between God and the Satan, where God says that Job is blameless, that he is righteous. Eventually, he gets so frustrated that he gives up on his friends. Their attempt at comfort has missed the mark. And at this point, Job is going through it. He's on an emotional roller coaster. If his friends' view of the world is true, if their view of wisdom and justice is accurate, if God is in control, if he is sovereign, and if he is good, and if he rules the world by justice, then what does that mean for Job? It doesn't make sense. He wants it to make sense. Job wants to believe that God is good, and he wants to believe that God is in control and that the world is governed by God justly, but that simply is not what he's experiencing in his own life. So what does he do? Does he give up on God? Does he give up on life? Does he give up on justice? A pause. When I was a kid, I had a family member who would just lie all the time and say I hit them when I didn't hit them. And then their mom would be like, you're grounded, you hit my son. I'm like, but I didn't do it. And I was so mad. And my dad gave me really poor advice, really, really poor advice. He was like, if you're getting in trouble for it anyway, just hit him. And I mean, it's tempting. It was tempting. I did that once. It was the wrong choice. But Job doesn't do that. He's not like, well, I'm suffering anyway. I might as well pillage. He doesn't give up on justice. He doesn't give up on God. He doesn't give up on life. But he does cry out and let his grievances be known to God. At one point, he even declares outright to God that God has wronged him. He does not hold back. Job lashes out for chapter upon chapter upon chapter. If you read the book of Job in its entirety, you can feel Job's desperation, his frustration, his confusion, incredulity, anger, and eventually hope. And while there's richness in Job's outcry, there's too many chapters to go through on a single Sunday, so I'd like to focus on God's reply. In Job 38. And it's a long chapter. It's 41 verses. It's worth reading its entirety. I think I might put you to sleep if I do that. So I'll read about half of it because it's a similar pattern all the way through. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Or what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far you shall come, and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal, and its features stand out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and their uplifted arm is broken. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked into the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all this. God's response to Job has always been really interesting to me. First, it's notable that God is not provoked by Job's bewilderment and questioning. He's not overwhelmed by it. He doesn't punish Job for it. He does say, like, who are you? What do you know? But he doesn't be like, smite you for asking. And that's important. I want us to know that the Bible clearly demonstrates that God can take our emotions, good and bad. It's great to praise God. He's worth praising, and I love that we get to do that together every Sunday. But it's okay to express negative emotions to God if you're feeling them. He knows you have them anyway. You aren't fooling the one who made you. If you're angry at God, if you're confused by his purposes, incredulous at the injustice that he seems to allow unfettered, if you're in unbearable pain, whatever it may be, bring it to him directly. Jesus made a way for us to communicate with God directly. Use it. So that part's encouraging. I love that God is big enough and cares enough for us to hear our grievances. But God's actual response to Job can at first glance be a little bit discouraging. He doesn't actually explain to Job why he's allowed Job to suffer. And you'd think he'd want to, right? Like, hey, you passed the test. There's this whole heavenly drama happening, and you proved the Satan wrong. High five. That's not what he does. He doesn't justify anything. Instead, he highlights how all of creation manifests his goodness and providence. It's almost as though God is saying, my ways are too great for you to understand, but they are more than enough to justify you trusting that I am sovereign and good and worth trusting. And I think that response is for us. If God wanted to respond in a way that was just for Job, I think he would have said, hey, there's a heavenly drama, you pass the test. But I think that God knows that all of us will eventually find ourselves in a situation where we wonder what's going on, and that it's more important to build trust for those storms than it is to give an explanation for why each storm comes. The ESV Study Bible puts it this way. The book as a whole illustrates that a full understanding of God's reasons for events is not a prerequisite for faithfulness amid terrible suffering. Almost like God says, my ways are too great for you to understand, but they should be enough to justify you trusting me. In life, we, like Job, may not get the answer we want and the one we think we need, but that doesn't mean that God isn't with us. It doesn't mean that he's not worth trusting. Throughout Job, a common word is comfort. It's repeated a lot. Job is searching for comfort. His friends try and fail to provide comfort. And Job does find comfort. He doesn't find a full explanation for his suffering, but he does find comfort, and not where he or we would expect it. He finds it in God's greatness and his unsearchable wisdom. And things do end well for Job. Later on, Job acknowledges God's sovereignty and wisdom and recognizes that he'll never understand God's purposes. And God restores everything lost to Job and more. The passage where Job kind of recognizes his place before God is chapter 42, verses 1 to 5. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Hear and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. God showed Job who he was, and that he could be Job's foundation through the storm. And that, all of Job kind of reminds me a little bit of Matthew 7, verses 7 to 11. I'm jumping, but I promise it's related. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. Or which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father, who is in heaven, give good gifts to those who ask him? At the end of the day, It comes down to knowing who God is and trusting he cares for you. How many of us can remember a moment where it felt like a parent or adult who knew us and loved us was working against us, only to later realize it was for our own benefit? 2 hands? I think, I'm going to imagine you all had it up. There's more. Another childhood story for me. I remember having a terrible ear infection that happened to coincide with a long-awaited family trip to Canada's Wonderland. I wanted to go so bad. I think I even tried to lie and say my ear was fine, possibly through tears. My family knew better. They knew that riding roller coasters and spending hours at a water park wouldn't do my ear infection any good and could make it worse. They knew I needed to rest. It felt like a punishment, though. It felt so unfair. Everybody gets to have fun, and I have to stay home and know that they're having fun and just be miserable. Why would you do this to me? And it was to protect me from getting worse. It was to help me heal. But I didn't recognize it as a good gift at the time. And many of us have a story like that from when we were kids. Most of us right now, everybody currently in here is an adult. So I'm sure we've been on the other side of the equation with kids, whether we have kids or interact with kids in any way. I'm sure we've had to be the person who's like, I know this feels like a bad gift. I promise you it's a good gift, and bear their fury in the moment. We've been given bread and fish from people who care about us and desire and work toward our good that we've mistaken for stones and serpents. And we've also given good gifts to people we love who may not see them the way they're intended. Now, I'm not saying that every gift we've been given or have given has been good. Sometimes we and those who love us miss the mark. Sometimes we misunderstand needs and how to meet them. And that's kind of the point. We're imperfect and we still manage to get it right some of the time. God, our Father in heaven, is perfect. He has perfect perspective. He has perfect timing. He has perfect discernment. He knows what a good gift is and how it will not only affect us, but those around us. And we may not always understand his ways, like Job, or his timing, but we know that God is steadfast and unchanging. We know who he is. We know his character. We know he loves us. We know he desires our good and welfare eternally, and we know he is powerful and can act beneficially toward us. We know he can be trusted. So Jesus tells us in Matthew 7, if we, flawed as we are, know how to give good gifts, how much more does our Father in heaven? And I can't help but think of the disciples when I think of Jesus, right? Because I'm like, I can't imagine me in Jesus's shoes very often, but I can imagine me as a disciple. And because we are, sort of. But anyway, and I highly doubt that on the day of Christ's crucifixion and the time between it and the resurrection, that it felt like a good gift. For the disciples, it likely felt much more like a deadly serpent than the way to eternal life. Maybe they felt a bit like Job in the moment, like everything was lost and they couldn't understand why. It didn't make sense. Why would a person as perfect as Jesus have to suffer so horribly? Why and how could God have allowed such an atrocious mockery of justice? Why would he let this happen to his son? The disciples didn't see it in the moment, but the resurrection showed them and us that the cross was not just a good gift, but the greatest gift we could ever and will ever receive. It was reconciliation with God our Father and eternal life through Jesus' atonement and defeat of death forever. O death, where is your sting?